A man can become tired in ways nobody notices. Not weak, not broken, just exhausted from carrying everything alone for too long. Exhausted from acting calm while pressure slowly destroys him inside. From staying silent because explaining the pain feels heavier than the pain itself. After a while, something changes in him. He talks less, laughs less, feels distant even around people. Not because he hates the world, but because disappointment has a way of making a man colder, especially when the deepest wounds come from the people he trusted the most. There are men who were not defeated by life. They were defeated by loneliness, by fighting battles in complete silence, while everyone assumed they were strong enough to survive anything. And the dangerous part about silent suffering is that nobody sees it until the soul is already exhausted. Sometimes a man sits alone for hours thinking about everything he lost, everything he could have become, and everything he still carries in his chest like a hidden war. But pain changes people. It teaches them. It hardens them. The man who survives darkness long enough stops fearing it. Not because he stopped feeling pain, but because he learned how to walk with it. And maybe that is what real strength is. Not smiling all the time, not pretending to be invincible, but continuing forward while your heart feels heavy. Continuing even when nobody claps for you, even when nobody understands your battles. Because some warriors are built in silence. And one day, all this suffering will become the reason you no longer break so easily. There comes a moment in a man's life where he realizes nobody is coming to save him. And strangely, that realization changes everything, because the boy who waited for understanding eventually disappears. The man who remains learns how to survive disappointment alone. He learns how to bury pain under discipline, how to hide exhaustion behind calm eyes, how to continue moving even when his mind feels heavy enough to collapse. Yet some nights become unbearable. You sit there staring into nothing, thinking about the pressure, the failures, the people who slowly change toward you without explanation. And the worst part is not the memories. It is the silence after them. The silence teaches hard lessons. It teaches a man that loyalty is rare, that effort is not always appreciated, that some people only love you when you are useful to them. After enough pain, a man becomes quieter, not weaker, quieter. He stops begging for attention, stops explaining his value, stops chasing people who can walk away from him so easily, because eventually pride wakes up inside him, and once it does, he would rather suffer alone than force himself into places where he is not respected. That is how warriors are created, not through comfort, through pressure, through betrayal, through sleepless nights, through carrying responsibilities while secretly feeling emotionally destroyed. Life has a brutal way of shaping strong men. It isolates them, tests them, breaks pieces of them until they either collapse or become dangerous levels of discipline. And the terrifying thing about silent men is that nobody notices how much they survived. Nobody sees the battles inside their minds. Nobody hears the conversations they have with themselves at 2 a.m., trying to stay strong one more day. But they continue anyway, step by step, even with scars, even with exhaustion, even with a heart that no longer feels as soft as before. Because deep down, they understand something important. Pain can destroy a man, but it can also build one. Sometimes a man reaches a level of sadness where he no longer reacts the same way. No anger, no shouting, no dramatic collapse, just silence. A terrifying kind of silence. The kind that comes after being disappointed too many times. After carrying emotions nobody cared to notice. After giving loyalty with a pure heart, only to feel replaceable in the end. And slowly, he begins to detach from everything, not because he wants to become cold, but because his soul is tired of bleeding for people who sleep peacefully after hurting him. There are nights where loneliness feels physical, like pressure inside the chest, like something heavy sitting on the soul. You try to distract yourself. You try to stay disciplined. You try to act normal. But deep inside, there is still a tired version of you sitting in the dark, asking one painful question. How much more can I carry before something inside me breaks? And nobody hears that question. Because men are taught to survive quietly, to hide pain, to swallow emotions, to continue functioning no matter how damaged they feel inside. So they walk through life with invisible wounds, smiling sometimes, working sometimes, even laughing sometimes, but the sadness never fully leaves. It follows them into quiet rooms, into late nights, into empty moments where memories suddenly return without warning. And the hardest battles are always the invisible ones. The battle against overthinking, against emotional exhaustion, against the feeling of becoming mentally distant from the world. Some people think strong men feel less pain. No, strong men simply become better at hiding it. They master the art of suffering in silence. And honestly, that kind of pain changes a person forever. Because once a man learns how alone he truly is during his darkest moments, he never sees the world the same way again. But maybe there is something honorable about continuing anyway. About waking up every morning carrying sadness nobody understands, and still choosing discipline over destruction, still choosing patience over collapse, still walking forward with a heavy heart and exhausted soul. Because sometimes survival itself is the most masculine form of strength. A man does not become emotionally distant overnight. It happens slowly, very slowly, one disappointment at a time, one sleepless night at a time, one silent heartbreak after another, until one day he no longer recognizes the person he used to be. The softness disappears first. The excitement disappears after that. Then even simple things stop reaching his heart the same way they once did. And people notice the silence, but they never notice what created it. Nobody sees the pressure inside a man who is trying to stay calm while his mind is falling apart. Nobody sees how exhausting it is to remain strong when life keeps testing the same wounds over and over again. There are moments where a man becomes so mentally tired that even speaking feels heavy. So he isolates himself, not for attention, not to seem mysterious, but because silence feels safer than explaining pain to people who would never truly understand it anyway. And during those lonely nights, he starts thinking differently about life, about people, about himself. He realizes how temporary everything is, how quickly love changes, how quickly loyalty disappears, how easy it is for people to forget everything you did for them once you stop being useful. That realization hardens the soul, not into evil, into caution, into emotional discipline. Because a man who suffered deeply stops giving his heart so easily, he becomes careful with his energy, careful with his trust, careful with who gets access to the broken parts of him. And honestly, some of the strongest men alive are carrying sadness nobody will ever know about. They still go to work, still smile respectfully, still handle responsibilities, while secretly fighting battles inside their own minds every single day. That is real pressure, the kind that shapes warriors, well, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind where a man sits alone at night, rebuilding himself in silence because nobody else is coming to do it for him. And maybe that is why pain changes certain men so much. Because after surviving darkness alone for long enough, they stop fearing difficult days. They become calmer, sharper, more disciplined, not because life became kind to them, but because suffering forced them to become stronger than they ever wanted to be. There are wounds a man never speaks about again, not because they healed, but because repeating the story no longer changes anything. So he carries it silently, the betrayal, the disappointment, the nights he almost gave up on himself, but still woke up the next morning, pretending everything was normal. People see discipline and think it means a man is at peace. They do not understand that sometimes discipline is just survival. Sometimes the gym is survival. Work is survival. Silence is survival. Because if he stops moving for too long, the thoughts return. And the thoughts are dangerous when a soul has been hurt too many times. A lonely man thinks deeply, too deeply. He remembers everything, every moment he stayed loyal while being taken for granted. Every time he swallowed pain instead of speaking about it. Every moment he felt emotionally abandoned while standing in a room full of people. That kind of loneliness changes the way a man looks at life. He stops expecting comfort, stops expecting fairness, stops believing that everyone has good intentions. And maybe that sounds cold, but pain removes illusions from people, especially from men who had to survive without emotional safety for too long. There are nights where exhaustion becomes unbearable. You sit there in complete darkness, staring at the floor, feeling like your soul has aged years in a few months. No energy to explain yourself anymore. No energy to argue. No energy to chase anyone. Just silence. Heavy silence. The kind that makes a person disappear emotionally long before anyone notices. And the terrifying part is, most people will never know how close certain men were to completely breaking, because strong men often suffer privately. They master the art of looking okay, even when their mind feels exhausted, even when their heart feels numb, even when life keeps pushing pressure onto shoulders already carrying too much. But something strange happens to men who survive suffering for long enough. They become mentally dangerous, not violent, not cruel, just unshakable. Because once you survive nights that almost destroyed you emotionally, ordinary problems stop frightening you. That pain builds a different kind of discipline, a colder discipline. The kind where a man learns to depend on himself emotionally because experience taught him that not everyone stays. And maybe that is why certain warriors become quiet after pain, because they understand something most people never learn. Real strength is not loud. Real strength is waking up with a heavy heart, with stress eating your mind alive, with memories still hurting you in silence, and still handling your responsibilities like your pain does not control you. That is strength, the ability to suffer without allowing suffering to turn you into a weak man. And one day, all those silent nights will mean something. Every scar, every lonely battle, every moment you thought you were losing yourself, it was shaping endurance inside you. Because pressure either destroys a man or introduces him to a version of himself the world cannot easily break anymore. After enough suffering, a man stops asking life to be gentle with him. He understands that pain does not care how tired you are. Pressure does not care how pure your intentions were. And loneliness does not disappear just because your heart is good. So something inside him changes. He becomes calmer, not because he found peace, but because he became familiar with disappointment. That is the terrifying thing about repeated pain. At first, it destroys you emotionally. Then, eventually, it teaches you how to survive emotionally numb. A man can sit with people he loves and still feel completely alone inside. He can smile during conversations while his mind is somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark, somewhere exhausted, thinking about responsibilities, thinking about failures, thinking about how long he has been carrying everything without rest. And nobody notices, because men become experts at hiding pain when they realize the world respects strength more than vulnerability. So they suffer quietly. They go to work quietly. They handle stress quietly. They lose pieces of themselves quietly. And at night, when everything becomes silent, the weight returns, the memories return, the overthinking returns, the exhaustion returns. That is when the real battle begins. Not the battle against people, the battle against your own mind, against hopeless thoughts, against emotional emptiness, against the feeling that life keeps taking from you without giving anything back. There are nights where a man feels mentally cornered, like he has been strong for too long, like he has carried pressure for so many years that even breathing feels emotionally exhausting. But he still remains standing. And honestly, that deserves respect, because continuing while emotionally exhausted is one of the hardest things a human being can do, especially when nobody truly understands how heavy your inner world has become. Some men are carrying entire wars inside their chest while speaking softly to everyone around them. That is masculinity people never talk about. Not dominance, not noise, not pretending to be emotionless, but endurance. The ability to keep your dignity while suffering silently. The ability to remain disciplined while your soul feels tired. The ability to protect your future even when your present feels painful. And pain changes the eyes of a man. After enough betrayal, he notices lies faster. After enough loneliness, he becomes comfortable in silence. After enough disappointment, he stops depending emotionally on people who are uncertain about him. Not because he hates people, but because life taught him that attachment without caution can destroy a man from the inside. So he learns control over emotions, control over reactions, control over the chaos happening inside his own mind. And slowly, the broken man begins rebuilding himself differently, colder, wiser, harder to manipulate, harder to shake emotionally, not heartless, just experienced. Because once a man survives the darkest period of his life alone, he realizes something powerful. If he survived that version of pain, then he can survive almost anything. And maybe the saddest part about strong men is that nobody sees the suffering that created them. People only see the discipline after the breakdown, the calmness after the chaos, the wisdom after the damage. But they never see the lonely nights where that man sat in silence, fighting himself just to make it to another morning. And maybe that is why certain men become dangerous in life, because pain forced them to master themselves. Not perfectly, but enough to keep walking forward while carrying storms inside their chest. There is a type of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix, the kind that settles deep inside the soul after years of pressure, disappointment, and silent battles nobody ever knew you were fighting. A man can reach a point where he is no longer physically tired, but emotionally drained from carrying everything alone, drained from always being the strong one, the calm one, the dependable one, while secretly wishing someone would ask him if he is surviving too. But life rarely pauses to comfort men. It keeps moving. Bills keep coming. Responsibilities keep growing. People keep expecting strength from shoulders already collapsing under invisible weight. So he adapts. That is what men do. They adapt to pain, even when it slowly changes them from the inside. And over time, the world mistakes that adaptation for emotional coldness. But they do not understand. A man who has suffered deeply does not become cold because he enjoys distance. He becomes cold because warmth once cost him too much, because every time he trusted too easily, he lost something: his peace, his energy, pieces of his heart. So, eventually he learns to guard himself, not out of arrogance, out of survival. There are moments where a man sits alone thinking about how different he used to be, how alive he once felt, how hopeful he once sounded, how easily he once laughed before life became heavy. And honestly, that realization hurts more than most people imagine, because nothing is more painful than watching yourself slowly become emotionally exhausted by life, especially when nobody notices the transformation happening inside you. The world only sees results. Nobody sees the pressure behind the discipline. Nobody sees the loneliness behind the maturity. Nobody sees the emotional scars hidden behind calm behavior. And sometimes, the strongest men are the ones closest to breaking. Not because they are weak, because they have been strong for too long without rest. A lonely warrior carries pain differently. He does not always cry. He does not always complain. Sometimes he simply becomes quieter, more distant, more thoughtful, more comfortable being alone than explaining himself repeatedly to people who only understand surface-level emotions. And silence changes a man. When you spend enough nights alone with your thoughts, you begin seeing life differently. You realize how temporary attention is, how fragile relationships can become, how quickly people disappear once you stop giving them constant access to your energy. That awareness creates emotional discipline. You stop chasing, stop begging, stop forcing connections that drain your spirit, because peace becomes more valuable than attention. And maybe that is what pain was trying to teach all along. Not hatred, not revenge, self-respect. The understanding that a man must protect his mind the same way he protects his future, because a destroyed mind can ruin an entire life. That is why strong men learn silence. Not every battle deserves a reaction. Not every betrayal deserves revenge. Not every disappointment deserves tears. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is walk away quietly and rebuild himself in private. And rebuilding yourself is painful. People romanticize growth without understanding what it costs. Growth costs comfort. It costs old habits. It costs versions of yourself you thought would live forever. Sometimes growth even costs people you never imagined losing. But suffering has a strange way of creating clarity. A man who survives enough darkness eventually stops fearing loneliness. He becomes familiar with it. He learns how to sit with pain without collapsing, how to control emotions without suppressing his humanity, how to continue moving forward even when motivation disappears completely. That is real discipline, not feeling powerful every day, but refusing to quit during the days where your soul feels exhausted. And one day, the same man who once cried silently at night becomes mentally untouchable, not because life became softer on him, because suffering trained him to endure things that would break weaker minds. That is why some men walk through life so calmly after pain. They already survived internal battles, far heavier than anything the outside world can throw at them. And deep down, they know no storm lasts forever, not even the ones living inside the human heart. A man who suffers in silence eventually becomes addicted to solitude, not because isolation feels good, but because it feels safer than disappointment, safer than false loyalty, safer than opening his heart only to watch people change when life becomes inconvenient. So he disappears into himself, into routines, into discipline, into late nights where nobody hears the thoughts destroying him quietly from the inside. And the frightening part is, most people around him never notice how much pain he carries, because he still functions, he still handles responsibilities, still answers respectfully, still shows up when needed. Meanwhile, his soul feels exhausted beyond words. That is the tragedy of strong men. People assume they are okay simply because they continue moving. But survival does not always mean peace. Sometimes survival is just a man forcing himself through another day, because quitting would destroy everything he built. There are nights where exhaustion becomes emotional, not physical, emotional. The kind where memories suddenly attack your mind without warning. The kind where your chest feels heavy for no clear reason. The kind where you stare into darkness asking yourself when life started feeling this empty. And no matter how disciplined a man becomes, he still feels pain. He still remembers betrayal, still remembers abandonment, still remembers the moments he needed support and received silence instead. Those moments harden people, especially men who had nobody to fall back on emotionally, because eventually they realize something dangerous. Nobody truly sees how damaged you are until the damage starts affecting your usefulness. That realization changes the way a man loves, changes the way he trusts, changes the way he speaks about his emotions. He becomes more controlled, not fake, controlled. He learns that reacting emotionally to everything only destroys his peace faster. So instead, he studies silence, studies patience, studies self-control, even while storms continue inside his chest. And honestly, there is something deeply painful about becoming your own emotional support system, about sitting alone trying to calm your own mind because nobody else understands the war happening inside you. A lonely warrior learns how to survive himself. That is a terrifying skill to develop, because once a man becomes used to suffering alone, he stops expecting rescue from anyone. He stops calling for help, stops explaining his sadness, stops believing people will stay long enough to understand him deeply. And slowly, his heart becomes quieter, not empty, just tired. Tired of carrying invisible pressure, tired of giving loyalty to uncertain people, tired of pretending certain wounds no longer hurt him. But pain also sharpens men. It forces maturity into them. A man who has cried alone enough times begins to understand life differently than others. He values peace more than attention. He values loyalty more than beauty. He values honesty more than temporary excitement. Because suffering teaches people what truly matters. And maybe that is why some of the calmest men have the darkest minds. Not evil minds, experienced minds. Minds that already visited emotional places most people could not survive for long. Places filled with loneliness, overthinking, pressure, fear of failure, fear of becoming emotionally numb forever. Yet, despite all of that, they continue. That is what makes certain men admirable. Not perfection, endurance, the ability to keep carrying responsibilities while mentally exhausted, the ability to remain respectful while fighting anger inside, the ability to continue building a future while emotionally bleeding in silence. Most people will never understand how difficult that is, because some battles leave no visible scars. But invisible scars still hurt, sometimes more than physical ones. And eventually a man reaches a point where he no longer wants revenge on the people who hurt him. He simply wants peace, real peace, a peaceful mind, a peaceful heart, a quiet life, far away from manipulation, chaos, and emotional games. Because after surviving enough darkness, a man stops craving excitement. He starts craving calm. And maybe that is the final stage of pain, not becoming heartless, becoming selective. Selective with energy, selective with trust, selective with who gets access to the deepest parts of his soul. Because once life teaches a man how painful betrayal feels, he never again gives his heart carelessly. The truth is, some men are smiling in public while secretly falling apart in private. And nobody notices because they mastered the art of looking composed. That is what years of pressure do to a person. They teach him how to hide exhaustion behind calm eyes, how to bury sadness under routine, how to answer "I'm okay" automatically even when his mind feels like a battlefield. A lonely warrior becomes difficult to read, not because he enjoys mystery, but because too many people misunderstood his pain when he tried to explain it before. So now he keeps everything inside. The stress, the fear, the emotional emptiness, everything. And over time, that silence becomes heavy. Heavy in a way words cannot fully describe. Because when a man spends years carrying emotions alone, he begins feeling disconnected from the world around him. He watches people laugh while his mind feels tired. He watches conversations happen while part of him remains trapped inside old wounds. And maybe the saddest part is this: some men are not asking life for happiness anymore. They are simply asking for a moment where their mind finally feels quiet. No overthinking, no emotional pressure, no memories replaying themselves at night. Just peace. But peace becomes difficult when a man has spent too long surviving instead of truly living. That is why certain men become obsessed with discipline, because discipline gives structure to chaos. The gym, work, late-night goals, self-improvement, isolation, those things become emotional survival mechanisms. Without them, the mind becomes dangerous. Because an exhausted mind can convince a man that his suffering will never end. And those are the moments where strength truly matters. Not during easy days, during nights where your chest feels heavy and you still decide to keep going anyway. That is real masculinity, not pretending emotions do not exist, but refusing to let emotions destroy your purpose. And suffering changes the way a man sees people. After betrayal, he notices dishonesty faster. After abandonment, he becomes careful with attachment. After enough loneliness, he realizes that depending emotionally on unstable people can break even strong minds. So he learns restraint. He stops giving unlimited access to his energy, stops explaining himself to people committed to misunderstanding him, stops chasing validation from a world that changes its opinion every day. Because eventually he understands something powerful. A man who depends completely on external comfort will collapse the moment life becomes cold. So he builds inner control instead, inner stability, even if the process is painful. And it is painful, very painful, because rebuilding yourself means confronting every broken part of your mind without running away. It means sitting alone with your thoughts until you finally understand them. Understanding your anger, your sadness, your fear, your loneliness. That takes courage. More courage than most people realize. Because many people distract themselves from pain, very few face it directly. But the men who survive that process become different afterward. Calmer, more disciplined, harder to emotionally manipulate. Not because they stopped feeling emotions, but because suffering forced emotional maturity into them. And one day, people will look at that man and admire his calmness without realizing how much pain created it. They will admire his discipline without seeing the nights he nearly collapsed emotionally. They will admire his strength without understanding the suffering hidden behind it. Because the strongest warriors are often built far away from attention, built in silence, built in pressure, built during nights where nobody was there to save them except themselves. And maybe that is why they become so hard to break afterward. Because once a man survives himself during his darkest period, the world no longer scares him the same way. After that point, a man stops fearing loneliness the way he once did, because loneliness already taught him everything people failed to teach him. It taught him patience, self-control, emotional discipline. It taught him how to sit with pain without collapsing in front of the world. And slowly, he becomes more silent than sad, more focused than emotional. Not because the wounds disappeared, but because he finally understood that constantly speaking about pain does not heal it. So he carries himself with dignity instead, even on difficult days, even during nights where memories still return unexpectedly. That is the thing about strong men. They continue quietly, without asking for applause, without begging for understanding. And one day, all those lonely nights, all that pressure, all those silent battles become the reason they walk through life with calm eyes and an unbreakable mind. Because pain either destroys a man or teaches him how powerful endurance truly is.